what does success mean in a business, a professional services firm? If success is a small group of people, doing just fine financially, that's not a very compelling vision for the future.
Andy, you have a passion for productivity. Where did this come from, and how does that drive you today?
Yeah, it probably sounds quite a peculiar thing to be passionate about, really, doesn't it?
It was, yeah.
Hunger, that desire to learn more, has been right there from the beginning. It might not be everything, but in the long term, it is everything.
What's one word your team would use to describe you?
I would use the adjective unreasonable. Always recruit people smarter than yourself.
When you start working with a new client, how do you determine if this is someone we can really help?
It's a matter of professional pride that we're going to show very quickly in those first couple of weeks something new. There's a problem. So we refer to this as hidden opportunity within a manufacturing plant, and get there quickly.
I can completely imagine that must be one of the most challenging.
As I walked into this area and seeing perhaps 6 of these very expensive pieces of equipment, actually how few of them were actually in motion. It surprised me. Being able to improve by 5, 10, 15%, this is worth tens of millions of dollars for these clients. I mean, that's, in a nutshell, that's what I built my career around. That's not to say we haven't found our own new mistakes, The reasonable man adapts himself to his environment. The unreasonable man adapts his environment to himself. Therefore, all human progress depends on the actions of the unreasonable man.
Andy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, David.
Let's start at the beginning. You've got a very interesting professional background, multifaceted, one might say, spanning aeronautical engineering, spent time in the nuclear energy sector, stint with the British Army, and now obviously running consultancy. It's not a typical career path, I would suggest. What's the common thread you think that kind of runs through that?
Thank you, David. No, it's a great question, and I'm not sure there's an obvious answer to it, but probably a couple of things that come to mind. There's a driving curiosity that sits behind, I think, anybody who chooses to go into particularly engineering. There's a sense of adventure, that certainly comes through from some of the things I did earlier in my career, and I'm keen to make sure that every day is a little bit different. And I think back, some of the earliest sort of memories associated with engineering and why I went down the path that I have gone down. I grew up in a rural area in the northeast of Scotland. Very supportive parents, encouraged me to do well academically, gave me every opportunity to learn and to understand how things work, and be very, very common, in our garden to see that perhaps it'd been an old television or washing machine that was no longer required, and I'd be there with spanners tearing this thing apart and trying to figure out how it works, taking a large motor and unwinding it to see how a motor actually sort of works its principles. And I think that hunger, that desire to learn more, is been right there from the beginning, driving through my academic career, and of course, it's very important to what I do today.
Fantastic. And you said when we spoke earlier that you have a passion for productivity. Where did this come from, and how does that drive you today?
Yeah, it probably sounds quite a peculiar thing to be passionate about, really, doesn't it?
It was, yeah.
Well, let me try and make sense of that for you. Very early in my career, probably the second job that I had after leaving the nuclear power industry, I worked for a boutique consultancy firm working in manufacturing plants. So one of the very first factories I ever worked in produced biscuits, cookies. And anybody in the UK, will be familiar with this particular type of biscuit, which is called a wagon wheel. And I'm sure you're familiar with that, but for your listeners, as a child, a wagon wheel feels like a really big biscuit. It's sandwiched, it's cream in the middle, it's covered in chocolate. Frankly, if you're 5 years old, you have to hold it with 2 hands. It's that big. It certainly feels that way. And I was working in the wagon wheel factory in South Wales. It's classic, straight out of Roald Dahl. There's conveyor belts everywhere. There's chocolate going everywhere. There's massive batches of marshmallows and toffee and everything you could possibly imagine. And this production line is very impressive. It's got about 12, maybe 16 sort of, rows of these biscuits all marching in uniform down this large conveyor and then going off into different packaging machines. And I've been tasked with trying to reduce the downtime on this production line. And I'm standing here, fairly early on in my career, surrounded by, as I say, wagon wheels on conveyor belts going into packaging machines, which have been wrapped and then wrapped again, and various operators. And it surprised me, that as I walked into this area and seeing perhaps 6 of these very expensive pieces of equipment, actually how few of them were actually in motion. Maybe only half of them were actually running. And I thought, well, that's odd. Surely, all of these should be running all of the time. And it became really apparent that actually when you're in an environment like that, problems happen. Problems happened a lot. The machines are stopping, they're causing, waste. And I've been tasked with trying to solve this. And I thought, okay, fine. So I'll stand on the line and, I'll watch what happens. And sure enough, you watch it for a period of time. And then for no apparent reason, the machine will go into some sort of convulsion and extra biscuits will get packed in, and then the machine will crash and it will stop and there's mess everywhere and operators come out and you ask people, well, what's happened? They just shrug their shoulders. No idea. No idea. It's just like the weather. Sometimes it runs well, sometimes it runs badly. I thought, okay, well, this is fascinating. This is the reality of what it means to run a factory. It's constantly dealing with problems. So given I've been tasked to try and solve some of these, I just spent time standing on the line, watching, trying to understand what was going on. And when I say time on the line, I'm talking hours, just watching the flow, the conveyors stopping and starting, looking at sensors, trying to almost build up in my mind a picture of the logic, the control logic that's taking place within these machines that's causing them to behave in the way that they are. And over a period of time, almost in complete simpatico with the machine. I can almost anticipate which conveyors will stop, it's going to move, where it's going to pack, where it's going to flow, where it's going to stop. And then all of a sudden, something strange and bizarre will happen. It won't behave in the way it's supposed to. An extra biscuit gets packed in, it crunches, it causes lots of mess. The machine stops. And with that understanding, I'm starting to build up this pattern of failure. It starts to dawn on me, well, hang on, there's something wrong in the logic. It should have done A, it did B. Then work with the client team, work with the engineers, get into the detail of the code, and you can see what's wrong. There's a pause where there should have been an input. There's something that's not quite right. The point is that's easily fixed, and you go back on the line. That problem's gone. And it started to dawn on me at that point. Well, hang on. If you can solve one problem through very focused, very clear problem-solving, pattern recognition, then you can solve 2. You can solve 10. You can solve 50. And over a period of time, this production line is running in a completely different way. It's no longer stopping. You no longer go into the hall and find half the machines sitting there idle. We're making 20% more out of this factory than we were doing previously. So when I talk about being passionate about productivity, it's this wonder that is the ability to be able to focus on the detail of what's happening in these complex technical environments and make a fundamental difference to the performance. And I'm as passionate about it now as I was then, and I still like wagon wheels.
Are they still making the wagon wheels?
They are so popular internationally as well. Yes, yeah, they absolutely are. Oh. Well, they're there.
Nice, interesting. And for you, is it going back to the kid in the backyard, taking apart the appliances and maybe putting them back together, maybe not? Is there kind of a payoff in the physical output that you see from the work?
That payoff, I suppose, comes in many different ways. For me personally, there's a huge amount of satisfaction about knowing that we've been able to achieve something. We're able to improve the performance, of a production line. For the clients, it can be huge. I mean, I'm jokingly starting with wagon wheels, but the same process applies to if you're on a large acetic acid plant in Texas or, in a lithium hydroxide refining complex in Western Australia. being able to improve by 5, 10, 15%, this is worth tens of millions of dollars for these clients. I mean, that's, in a nutshell, that's what I built my career around. And we'll talk about Chartwell. And it's hard. That's how Chartwell help our clients.
Completely. And that could take a business that's effectively failing to one that's suddenly profitable by tens of millions of dollars.
You're exactly right. And it's very personally rewarding, when we do have the opportunity. Very often it's coming through the business owner, where they recognize that a business is not where they want it to be. And we can come in, we can look at some of the fundamentals. Yes, it will become broader than technical problem solving. It'll have to talk about, the way they're structured, the way that perhaps they're dealing with their supply chains, the way perhaps they're dealing with, forecasting and sales and operational planning and slightly more sort of technical elements like that. But there are quite a few examples now where we've been able to help take a business which was not viable at all and turn it around.
Yeah. That's a perfect segue onto Chartwell. So just, I guess, take us back to the moment that idea or concept crystallized in your mind. What was the opportunity you saw? And tell us a bit about the early days.
So I started thinking that Chartwell was going to be set up probably 2010, 2011. We actually set it up in 2013. I've been through other similar consultancy businesses, some which I've been an employee in, another one which I was a founder in as well. But I was at a point in my life where, I'd bought a manufacturing company. I had run that for a few years. That had not turned out in the way I'd hoped it would. But also I learned through that process what I really value, and that's working with driven, smart people, helping clients to achieve really meaningful outcomes. And frankly, that's the thing that I'm good at. So I wanted to do that, and I wanted to go back to doing that as my main focus, my main career. Fortunately, I had some good friends in a similar position. We set up Chartwell, say 2013. At the beginning of 2013 was when we really got up and running. So we were the early partners in the business. We managed to persuade a couple of very smart young engineers to come and join us on that journey. But it was great fun. We had to roll up our sleeves. We were right in the heart of it, back into solving problems in industrial businesses. But it was also a point to decide, what would make this business special? How would we define this business? Think about the values, think about the vision. Where did we want this business to get to? And we set ourselves some goals. We said, look, this is a business which, we can see there's a lot of value that can be added to our client base. There's certainly money that can be made if we can do that well. But this business, we want it to endure. We want it to have a long, thriving sort of future. We almost, in some extent, want to create, almost like the McKinsey of manufacturing. The name which people at boardroom level would go to when they think about helping their manufacturing organization to be, where it really needs to be. And we set ourselves some objectives. We wanted to bring some of the smartest people we could find to come and join us. We were very clear that our mission would be to focus our resources on predominantly manufacturing and operations heavy businesses to make them more productive. That ultimately leads to them become more profitable, but also to make this a really meaningful career path for the people who join us. People who are, coming in from university with great educations in science and engineering, and give them an important career path which will be financially worthwhile. There'll be lots of development, lots of growth and opportunities, and still at their heart, they're using that engineering skill, the science, the things which they enjoy, and they can continue to use that through their career. Yeah. It was a great time.
What was it like? You mentioned your co-founders were friends.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important.
What was that like, starting a business with friends?
I reflect on what it would look like if I was doing this with people who weren't friends. Which is, look, financially things are difficult at the early stages of any startup. And if you're working with people that you trust, you enjoy spending time with, the difficult times, you can laugh about them. You can look out for each other. You can trust that the rest of your partners are looking out for you. Yeah. If that's not there, then, and I've seen this in other businesses, what you end up with is too much time, too much energy being spent worrying about things internally and your governance and your structure and who's going to get paid and expenses and all sorts of things which frankly should be draining time away from what really matters, which is our clients and leading the talent in our business.
Completely. And what's it been like? So you start with this, this tight group of people who've got these great relationships, and now you've obviously scaled the business over the last decade and more. What have been some of the key challenges you've faced as you've grown the business?
There's been many. I did say when we set up the business that we would try very hard not to make the mistakes we've seen other people make. I think we did reasonably well at that, but that's not to say we haven't found our own new mistakes. I think there's a few things to comment on. I mean, one of the obvious ones is, what does success mean in a business, a professional services firm? And if success is a small group of people, doing just fine and doing fine financially, that's not a very compelling vision for the future. That's not a vision that others are going to want to get behind and support. So there needs to be some element of growth, some element of how the business is going to be meaningful 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. The pitfall with growth is if growth becomes the goal, we end up making mistakes. We'll take on more people than we have work for. We'll end up taking on perhaps overheads that we can't necessarily support yet. So recognizing, I think that the prime focus for us is delivering the highest quality work. We work in a relatively small community of senior executives within manufacturing companies. When we do good work, the message gets out and people are aware of that. And it almost becomes a bit of, are you in the club? Do you know that this opportunity exists and this group of people, they're here? The converse is true as well. You make a mistake and people are aware of that, and one or two you can get away with. But if you're having too many of those, then the reputation's shot, and that's a very hard thing to recover from. I hope never to find myself in that position. So there are mistakes there from a growth perspective. Let's grow at a rate that makes sense, and it's a consequence of the work that we're doing and the building up the quality and building up the relationships, the network, and the pipeline of clients who want to work with us, and that seems to be a route to a happier outcome.
Yes, it's very clear to me, speaking with you previously, speaking with you now, you have a very clear philosophy about how you work, how the business should work, and you've mentioned a few times you're very focused on delivering the outcome. And I think you said to me on the pre-call as well, we do deliver decks, but that's not what we're getting paid for. Diagnostics, that's not what we're getting paid for. It's the tangible results at the end. How do you build that culture within a team that is growing so that each and every person is completely in line with that and delivering it as you want it?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time at the beginning thinking very clearly about how to answer that question. I suppose what I would look at, what I'd reflect on is, first of all, we are recruiting people into our business who have that mindset. They're driven, they're smart. I often refer to a particular quotation from George Bernard Shaw that I like, and if you forgive the use of genders here, when he says man, he means mankind. But the quotation goes something along the lines of, the reasonable man adapts himself to his environment. The unreasonable man adapts his environment to himself. Therefore, all human progress depends on the actions of the unreasonable man. And that's what we have. We've got a team of unreasonable people. They expect change. They insist that what we are doing when we're working in our clients' organizations, hopefully doing it in a nice way where the client feels that this is not too abrasive, but being done in a way where they're insisting that we are making change happen. And we very much are seen as that sort of catalyst, those agents for making change happen, whether it's the technical problem solving or whether it's that more sort of feedback, cultural, role model behavior. That's probably the most powerful starting point, the right group of people with the right attitudes and the right approach. We then build into our whole internal structures a focus on results. In fact, I've just come today from our Office Friday, And what we're doing on our Office Friday is having every team member is having the opportunity to present back to their peers. Here's an example of something that I've done this month where I've delivered something very tangible, usually in the form of a very clear chart, improving, going up. This is what I've done this month to make my client better. Here's my results. And we have a culture in the business of celebrating those results. So it's a genuine tear in the eye moment when, we see a new member of the team have their first big win and they're so proud, as they should be, of what they've achieved, and they can show their graph and we can all celebrate it together. And that's important. That's at the heart of our culture. I try to make sure that our compensation system is at least aligned with that. So people's development is aligned with results. Our clients, they know that that's what we're offering. That's why we're there. And in some cases, many, in fact, of our client engagements, there's a clear link between the commercial arrangement that we have with the client and our fees are predicated on those results coming through. So we tried hard to build it into everything that we do and to make sure there's nothing in there which gets in the way of what matters. Which is why your point about report writing, it's a means to the end. It's not the end in itself. And frankly, if I've got the choice of an extra couple of hours writing a report or an extra couple of hours solving one more problem, that's an easy decision, and everybody knows that.
When you start working with a new client, you mentioned before you do a general assessment of what it is that they have, what are the capabilities, what are the problems. What are you really looking for when you start that process, and how do you determine if this is someone we can really help? And have there been scenarios, in fact, where maybe you've turned down work because you felt you couldn't deliver a result?
I think it's important to set the scene that most of our clients are high-performing organizations. So these are not organizations where you would say they are underperforming. There's a problem. We're not coming in necessarily into an environment where it is known that there's a problem. It's a good, solid, well-invested organization with very capable people. The last thing I want to be doing is coming in there and simply just regurgitating what they already know. It's a matter of professional pride that we're going to show very quickly in those first couple of weeks something new. We're going to bring something new to the table which they had not previously been looking at, and gets people's interest. Builds up our credibility very quickly as well. So we refer to this as hidden opportunity. We are looking to find that hidden opportunity within a manufacturing plant and get there quickly. I mean, ideally within the first 2 or 3 days. And there's various different approaches we use for that, depending on the nature of the manufacturing process. Is it large-scale, continuous chemical? Is it more of a manual process where people are assembling fast-moving consumer goods, where we're making lots of bottles of beer or something similar? So there's a different approach, but at its heart, at the philosophy of the approach, it's finding the gap between that theoretical perfect world, that Roald Dahl factory I was referring to at the beginning, where the expectation is that everything is just running at full speed all of the time, nothing ever goes wrong, and the reality of where that business happens to be at the moment. Understanding that gap, technically being able to deep dive into a few specific examples of where those losses are so that we can show to the organization that these are solvable. They might be challenging, but they are solvable problems. We're also looking to see where our clients are in their own improvement journeys. We'll refer to this as their improvement readiness. Some of our organizations are much earlier. There are some basic fundamentals that need to be put in place. Others are very sophisticated and have a lot of very capable individuals with experience in this space. We want to make sure that we're adding value in any of those situations and we can move our clients forward on the journey. So we're building that up. So generally, at the end of those first 2 weeks, there's a conversation with the senior client where they are surprised at the scale of opportunity that's available. They are very happy to see it because there's a lot of money attached. And we've built up enough credibility with the local team that the local team want to move forward. So you asked the question, are there situations where we would not move forward? Well, if one of those 3 things has not happened, then we probably won't move forward. There are situations where we've found opportunity, but the value of the opportunity perhaps is not large enough. That can happen. Usually, we'll spot that earlier. We won't have to wait the full 2 weeks, and we'll just step back a bit and go, guys, this is not the right place in the organization for us. There's probably different ways you need to look at this. That happens less frequently because we sort of qualify those out at an earlier stage. What can be challenging is the relationship with the client. It's so vital that we're working well with the client, that we're aligned, that we've all got the same goal, that there's nothing in the relationship perhaps with the senior client that's going to inhibit progress. And if we see things there which are not quite right, we'll put those on the table. And if we don't think we're going to be able to work well together at that point in time, then we'll say so. And we'll say, well, look, here are the things probably that need to happen before we're ready for us to work together. And, usually there's a certain amount of respect for the honesty and the openness that allows us to come back and have another conversation, maybe 6 months or a year or two sort of down the line. I've got to say it's rare. It's not that often that happens.
Yeah. I can completely imagine that must be one of the most challenging aspects, is working with, once you've identified perhaps areas for improvement, how you communicate those into the client. Because like you said, these are top professionals, and some people may see that as maybe a threat to, that means I've not been doing my job properly, and therefore how am I going to look when this comes out? And how do you handle that? I guess that balance, that delicate.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on. I referenced earlier, I wouldn't make the mistakes I've seen others make, but I'll make plenty more, ourselves. It's everything, frankly. It's right at the heart of the whole process. Understanding technically how to make things better is nothing if you can't engage well with the client. So the things that you referenced there, the potential defensiveness, this might be look bad. What's the implications for my career? We have to address those right at the outset before we start. The best way is with our senior client. It's quite often at a chief operating officer level, or perhaps a senior vice president of manufacturing. If we see that there's a cultural issue within the organization where people are perhaps fearful of showing too much of what's really going on because they feel that their careers will be in some way harmed, we have to have that conversation with the senior executive and say, this is one of the barriers to progress. It's this culture. And this culture it comes from the top of the organization. Now, we can work together to help solve that, but you're going to have to get involved, Mr. COO, in demonstrating that you are committed to making sure that nobody will get harmed by being open and honest about the performance of the plant and the things that need to happen. And I've got to say, many of our clients, you don't get promoted to COO unless you're very good at what you're doing. They get it. They get it very quickly. They want that to change. They very often want that cultural shift. So, it just becomes part of the project plan, but a really important part. And we have to get it right at the early stages.
Yeah, completely. And you talked before about the wanting to provide opportunities, career opportunities for scientists, mechanics coming out of university graduates, people in the industry. And I understand you're hiring from top institutions around the world. How do you help translate that technical brilliance that these people no doubt have when you bring them in? How do you help them translate that into commercial impact?
Yeah. Interesting. I think the first thing to say is to some extent, that journey that I experienced early in my career, I have to create that journey for these individuals. And, we're very fortunate to work within some wonderful manufacturing environments. Many of them are quite visual, so you can see what's happening. Others, there's a lot of data available. So I can start by putting people in a position where they can see the value that they can add, they can solve the problems, they can build up that confidence that they are developing a skill set which is hugely useful, hugely valuable for them, hugely valuable for the clients that they're working with now. And frankly, whether they choose to stay with Chartwell, stay in our industry, or leave after a couple of years, they will always have that skill set. I sometimes jokingly refer to that as our trade. If you can do this, if you can go to any production line, any factory, and confidently add value, that's something you've got for the rest of your life. You've always got that. So that's like the first platform. But there's a very fast progression through the grades within the business. A lot of thought and care has gone into what structured training is required. There's a lot of training. It's actually 2 full days a month dedicated to training for everybody in the organization. So you can imagine that's a big commitment on our side, but vital to allow these talented individuals to be able to grow and learn very, very quickly. So as we move from being able to improve a production line to improving a whole factory, the conversation at that point with a factory manager is not just an operations one. It is one of, well, how are you impacting on the P&L of the business? What is the implications of the improvements we're making if we are able to sell more? But what if we can't sell more? How do we actually make sure the business is actually still financially improving? What are the implications for capital investment? You may have particular projects we want to invest in, but really that investment could be applied elsewhere because we can achieve the same goals through other routes. Those conversations, they will be happening early in people's careers, perhaps just 2 or 3 years in. And of course, I come back to the commercial relationships we have with our clients. We have to put a return on investment, and that has to be very clear to everybody what that return on investment is. So we need to be able to see what the return is. And of course, that's in dollars or euros or pounds. So we need to be able to make sense of it.
I think one question that all executives consider and deal with and ultimately are trying to find the answer to is what are the metrics that drive our business?
I think it's difficult to suggest that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. I think the reality is my relationship with a client will be starting with a conversation, usually with a senior executive, perhaps CEO, perhaps COO, where we're going, what is it that you are trying to achieve? Are you looking to grow your business through more capacity? Trying to avoid spending more of your hard-won capital on investment in new plant that can otherwise be spent on something else, perhaps innovating the next new technology that's coming along. So we have to have that understanding of where that business is in its particular cycle. Some of the smaller businesses, perhaps we've come through to the business owner, it's a very clear metric. It's profitability or perhaps working capital tied up in the process, inventory. From that start point, and that's the clear goal, the singular goal that we're sort of focusing on, we can then work through the tree of the things which really matter and prioritize. So if it is about more capacity, then we need to work our way through, okay, where are the bottlenecks in the process? What are the things that determine, how much we can get through the bottleneck? Where are the key levers on perhaps quality, for example? Perhaps the 5 or 6 quality parameters which define where this particular client sits in the market space, which we have to get right and we have to improve. Perhaps it's delivery performance is the key. The CEO has identified if we can reposition our delivery performance, if we can deliver make-to-order parts in 3 weeks rather than the current 12 weeks, we can reposition ourselves against the competition and charge more. Those are all things that we can then convert into operational metrics and work directly with the people on the shop floor, first-line supervisors. Very often they're the most important people in any manufacturing business. There's the first tier of leadership, with operators, with fitters, engineers, etc., to work out what's the operational goals that we have to set for ourselves in order to achieve that first business goal. But I think it's part of our process is the client knows they're not going to come in and get the same answer they had the last time they worked with us, or it's going to be, something we're just dusting off the shelf. We really put a lot of thought and care into making every project bespoke and specific to the needs of that client.
On the US side of things, what are some of the challenges that these US manufacturers are going to face, you think, over the next 12 to 24 months in terms of scaling up?
Well, there's the short-term challenges and then there's the longer-term challenges. I think the short-term challenges, this is such a substantial change in supply chain that we're asking in a very short period of time. And industry by industry, they're going to have their own unique challenges. Whether it's currently being reliant on 50% of nitrates that we use to for the farmers and to feed people coming from outside of the United States. Well, it takes a while to spool up new factories. So that's going to create opportunities for those who are currently in that space right now. But in reality, the people who are consuming those products are going to have to pay more. There's no question that that is going to work its way through the economy. And at some point, there's going to be some hardship. I think the administration in the United States has said as much, and to expect that. But it will leave the United States in a stronger position. I think if we look out slightly further, I think some of the really exciting things that we're seeing is the level of commitment and investment into, so let's say, some of the industries which perhaps have been allowed to decline over a period of time. You can talk about shipbuilding. The level of shipbuilding that takes place outside of the United States compared to what has taken place over the last 20 years inside the United States is quite remarkable. But that, again, has been encouraged to turn around. But probably the most exciting story, I think, in manufacturing for the next 10 years is our advanced semiconductors. The 4 nanometers sort of chips, which historically have only really been produced in Taiwan, and using equipment and machinery built by one company in the Netherlands. There is a concerted push for that capability to be in the United States. There's a lot of investment that's taken place over the last 5 years. I think we're going to see the first chips going into our iPhones coming from US manufactured plants very soon. That's a major shift in the tectonic plates of technology and manufacturing capability.
Yeah, and there's no doubt there are some huge challenges to ramping up manufacturing in the US, whether it's skilled labor shortages, having access to the right materials, red tape, and actually building the facilities. These are all things that, like you said, you don't just snap your finger and it's fixed.
Yeah.
So what I'm really looking forward to seeing is entrepreneurs solving these, like entrepreneurs like you, quite frankly, being given these huge problems. And we're going to see, hopefully, a wave over the next, whatever it is, 10 and 20 years of hopefully incredible ingenuity, innovation that's going to be coming from businesses.
Oh, look, couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. If I can compare this perhaps to a different point in time, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were very clear statements being made at the beginning of the 20th century that we were going to run out of nitrates. They were a commodity. They were a resource that was being essentially sort of mined, in South America, and there was a real fear at that point that we would not have enough to support the growing population. And they were talking about by 1930 we'd have mass starvation because we simply couldn't grow enough crops to feed the world's population. And we've forgotten about that now, but that panic was increasingly growing. The solution came, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, the solution came from the dedication and hard work of entrepreneurs, one particular one, engineers, again, a particular engineer in this particular case, there was Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, together in Ludwigshafen and in Germany, and they worked out over a period of time through hundreds of trials, thousands of trials, how to make nitrates from the air, from the nitrogen in the air, and convert it into something that we could use as fertilizers. It completely revolutionized the whole of farming. Frankly, I think I've seen statistics suggest that half the world's population would not exist today were it not for the industrialization of ammonia production, which is the Haber-Bosch process, which is still used today. That was focused, great people with the resources made available to them, solving the biggest challenge of their day. If I look at where we are today, particularly with our energy resources, a very strong commitment to move to net zero. But our ability to move to net zero is restricted in some respects by our ability to make our businesses commercially viable. I've referenced the cost of energy. That problem does not get solved any other way than through technology, great engineers, great entrepreneurs building new businesses, trying things. Some will work, some will fail. I don't know. None of us know, what exactly is going to be the right answer here, whether it's going to be green hydrogen, whether it's going to be clean carbon. I would love in my lifetime to see small-scale nuclear fusion actually work. It's possible. We put more energy and time into this in the last 10 years than we have done in the previous 20. So that's where it's going to happen. And we're going to celebrate these achievements. And in my heart, I'm an optimist. I have to be. I believe that that's how, as a society, we get better.
During your time with Chartwell, you don't have to necessarily name names here. Could you give us a case study, perhaps, of a client you've worked with that you were so proud of the result? Maybe the one you look back. I'm sure there's lots you look back on fondly, but is there one that jumps to mind?
There is one, and I'm proud of a lot of what, not just me. And I think at this point, this is very much my team. We've got a team of 70 professionals who just do this thing. Who just go in. So we're very much talking about me and my team at this stage. March 2020 changed everything for all of us. And for Chartwell, our story at that point was we were involved in a number of large manufacturing plants in China, in North America, across Europe, and things were going well. And then this disease came along. And suddenly the factories started shutting themselves off to visitors, and some of them were closing down altogether. And in the space of just a couple of weeks, that was it. I had 80% of my team were on the bench. No revenue coming in, not quite sure what we were going to do. The ones that were staying on site were in high priority industries, mainly food, in order to make sure that we could continue to supply. But 80% of my team had been benched. So of course we have to pivot. It's in our nature to try and find how we're going to make ourselves useful. And of course, there were a number of things during that period where our team were able to make themselves useful. The team in the US were able to get involved in the vaccine scale up manufacturing. Our European teams got involved in some key pharmaceutical supply chains. Here in the UK, we were able to get involved with the diagnostics industry. And one particular company down in the south of England who were producing a PCR testing kit. Now, of course, prior to March 2020, I don't think many of us had heard of what PCR is. Now I think we're all very familiar with what that whole process looks like and how important it was. Well, this small company in the south of England, about £12 million turnover business, lovely business, group of great scientists, great facilities, labs, focusing on providing PCR testing for academia, vets, research purposes, doing it well, but at small scale. But very capable individuals. They had identified a particular assay set, primers and probes for detecting COVID-19. And they got World Health, or the WHO, approval for their product in February 2020, so very early on. And as a result of that, they won their first government contract. The first contract, I think, was about £160 million. This is a 12 million turnover business. It speaks a lot to where we were at that point in time, that we were willing to make those sort of decisions. It also says a lot to the CEO and the senior team in that business that they were prepared to do whatever it took to support the UK with our diagnostics requirement. But that is such a big challenge. So there was a conversation between myself and the CEO, and went backwards and forwards. And I remember him looking me in the eye and said, I don't have time to waste here, Andy. You need to just, no BS. Are you going to be able to do this? And I looked him in the eye and I thought, Graham, this is my whole career has led up to this. This really feels like everything I've done has been leading towards how do we help a manufacturing company achieve what needed to be done here. And this was a 100-fold increase in manufacturing capacity was required in 2 months. This is unheard of in peacetime. This just never happens. A 100-fold increase in 2 months. Well, that felt like that was a worthwhile challenge. We were absolutely, we gave it our all. I mean, myself, about 10 members, the most senior members of my team, applied ourselves to this. I had Jenny straight into the laboratories, figuring out how to get 10 times as much throughput through the laboratories. Did that in the first week. I had Joe build a full materials resource planning process. He did it overnight. So we came in the following morning with every single bill of material understood for this PCR testing kits. There's 52 of them, exactly how many we needed with this exponential curve for every 52, how many we needed at every single day over the next 6 months in order to make sure we hit every single one of our production requirements, and we'd never let the side down. I had Rob calling up companies all over the world trying to find where we could secure the different materials we needed, these enzymes, the plastic vials that were needed, all of this. We then had to deal with challenges which weren't just internal challenges, but the challenges that the world had put in our path. So who would have thought, I certainly wouldn't have done, that at that point in time, one of our biggest challenges was getting a particular enzyme, a very valuable enzyme. We bought about £4 or £5 million worth of these enzymes in the United States. Factory had sold them to us, cash had moved, transferred. We got it as far as JFK, and the American authorities put a block on it leaving the country because, rightly, they recognized it was an important part of the whole pandemic response. So we were having to liaise with British government, to liaise with the American authorities to get this released. So I've got to be honest, it was hugely exciting, and from a professional perspective, I was never see anything like this before. Hotels were closed. We were in lockdown. So we had permission from a member of the government that allowed us to travel, but there was no hotels. So we had an Airbnb where we were all living. So right the way through the evenings, talking about the plans, what we need to do to move things forward. It was almost 24 hours, sort of just focus on doing this. But boy, oh boy, it worked. That was it. I'm so proud. We've got trophies that we have that we gave to all the client team members who were involved with this huge scale up that happened. And we did it, a 100-fold increase in 8 weeks. It was really quite unprecedented. And at its heart, it was about focus, results, only do the things that need to be done to get those results, but get them done quickly, debottlenecking laboratories, and of course the urgency was there across the board, not just with the client team, but with everybody we spoke to, whether it was with other suppliers who were desperate to get involved and help with the challenge at that time. We brought on about another 5 subcontractors to help with the production. People in government couldn't have been more helpful. They were sitting there waiting for an opportunity to be able to do something that really had a concrete, meaningful impact, like helping solve the challenges of bringing things in. So that was quite a story. I don't think I'll ever see anything quite like that again.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I said we never see anything like this happen in peacetime.
Yeah.
It can happen.
Can.
At other times. Yeah.
Of course. There's an ongoing, you were alluding to the possibility of war there. There's an ongoing war for talent right now. Has been for a while. Why do you think sort of the brightest minds in the world should be thinking about manufacturing as the best place to apply their talents?
Yeah, because there's plenty of other shiny, exciting things that smart people can be doing. Well, we live in a physical world. We need food. We need transportation has to be physical. The goods that we enjoy to make our lives more enjoyable are physical. The IT infrastructure is predicated on physical things. These physical things have to be manufactured. Yeah. And I can't see a future, maybe it's a lack of ambition and lack of vision for myself, I can't see a future where that changes. We are going to need to be able to convert raw materials through to sophisticated finished products which are value adding in our lives. So that's the starting point for me. That's important. That's worthwhile. Why would talented, smart people want to be involved in that field? Well, it's very tangible. You can see the impact you're having in a very, very clear way. You can see, whether it's over a project over a few weeks and months, whether it's working with a client over a few years, you're not left in any doubt as to how your efforts have converted to an improvement in that particular client and their commercial fortunes. But probably more important, or certainly as important, but probably more important, is the relationships you build up with the people that you work with. Their jobs will have been made more interesting. their careers very often will have been enhanced because the outcomes, the results of what they achieve mean that they are going to be more eligible for promotion. And very often some of the really frustrating things that take place, in any business, but particularly in a manufacturing business, and we referred to this earlier, whether it's problems with the culture, whether it's problems with, the environment where you feel that you can't be completely open because it'll have negative consequences. These things are changing, and we can feel enormous personal sort of reward at knowing that that's come as a result of your efforts, the result of your energy. I'll also be frank with you. I've deliberately, set this business up in such a way that we can pay people well. I wouldn't want a smart engineer comparing us with for example, a top law firm or a top consultancy firm in strategy and going, those are better options because I'll earn more money. No, this route, this career will earn you as much, if not more, than you would do in those career paths. And I think that's special. There's certainly when I graduated as an engineer, I didn't see many ways to stay an engineer and be able to earn, an income sort of comparable to those other firms. So there's a few different examples there. I would also perhaps come back to one of the things I said earlier on. It's a great bunch of people that we get to work with. And, if there's one thing that I would point to that really makes me feel so good about working in this environment, I'm working with some very smart, very driven people, keep me on my A game, and it just makes it fun.
What's your message to CEOs, COOs, other executives who are listening to this, who know that their operations are not running as efficiently as they ultimately could, but they don't really know where to start in terms of tackling that? What would you say to them?
Well, it'd be remiss of me not to have the sales pitch at the beginning of the answer to that question. So, of course, you'll find us on Google. We're out there. Get in touch. So let's assume that's a given. Yeah, please, we'd be more than happy to help. No, at its core, and I think good CEOs know this. So I recognize that when I say it. You have to surround yourself with a great team. These are not just people who are experienced in the field, but are people who question, people who challenge, people who are open to being challenged and will dig in. And whether it's the COO or the chief operating officer or the senior person in manufacturing, or frankly the CEO, get close to where the real value is in your business. If your business is manufacturing toilet roll, get right down on the shop floor where that's been produced. If your business is manufacturing pharmaceuticals, then then see the process, understand, be in the control room where the people who are ultimately controlling what's happening, that you can see it happen. You speak to the people, you understand what some of their challenges are. You build up a sense, you build up a picture of where some of those opportunities are. The question then is, what do you do about it? And I come back to have a good team, people who are open to being challenged, working on these problems. I would suggest, with all humility, but I would ask those senior executives and CEOs, don't accept the capital expenditure solution that's put on the table as your first port of call for improving the productivity in your business. That's very often the way that it's perceived. There will be other ways. Keep that capital, use it to help move the business forward, find ways to drive that productivity with the investments that have already been made. And it's that would be a good starting point.
We're going to finish up with our rapid fire round.
Wonderful. Great.
Yeah. So I'm going to fire some questions at you. And I'd like you to answer with the first thing that comes to mind.
Oh, this is going to be dangerous.
Yes, it could be. What's one word your team would use to describe you?
Well, I think having already provided the quotation from George Bernard Shaw, I would use the adjective unreasonable.
biggest productivity myth?
Apologies, this might not be rapid fire. That it's dull, and it's academic, and it doesn't really matter, because that's just not true. Nobel Prize-winning economists have said this, but productivity, it might not be everything, but in the long term, it is everything. And if you're looking over the span of 50 years, it makes all the difference in terms of the quality of life, in a group of people, and within a business. It can be the difference between success and failure. So, okay, the quick answer to your question is, the myth is it's not sexy. It doesn't matter. It does matter. And maybe if I can have a follow-up in there, is there's more to it than just spending money on capital expenditure.
Yeah. I'm going to break my own rules quickly here, because do you think, based on what you've just said about productivity and it over the long run, it being everything, do you think it gets the attention it deserves? I think from businesses and execs, probably, although you can correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly from kind of a government and societal point of view, do you think it gets the attention it deserves?
The people who give it attention are people who are thinking deeply about society, industry, challenge. And you hear them talk about it, and great economists and great journalists and politicians do refer to it. But there's a big gulf between the recognition that our productivity is not growing. In the last 20 years, our productivity, certainly in the UK and in Europe, has not grown in the same way that it did in the previous 80 years. Yeah. And that'll be a problem. That's already proving to be a problem. We don't have a good way of bridging the gap. And I'm unfortunately not also going to be able to give you a succinct, broad brush answer on how to improve productivity, because what I see is that productivity is very much about, on a person by person basis, what are we doing? How are we interacting? How am I generating more output from what I'm doing? Am I culturally being encouraged to generate more output from my time? Am I being financially encouraged to generate more output? Do I have the infrastructure around me to be able to do that? I've talked about problem solving as a route to generating productivity improvement. There are other ways on a sort of micro level where you can achieve that. Businesses, of course, productivity improvement is an annual increase in performance. And if we set ourselves the goal of 7% productivity improvement every year, that means every single business needs to be at least 7% more profitable on a like-for-like basis than it was the previous year. That's rare to see that, but that's essentially what it would mean, and that's the challenge that businesses need to set for themselves. How does government influence that? I think that's difficult, because the reality is that they don't have as many levers as perhaps they might have done 100 years ago to influence that. But I think having the conversation, the dialogue, the recognition that it's in all of our interests, not just the shareholders of a business, but it's in all of our interests to see that productivity improve. It starts to become easier to have conversations where there are blocks, holds on wanting to improve productivity. Early in the 20th century, it took 40% of the population of the United States to feed themselves. 40% of the population worked in agriculture. By the end of the 20th century, it was 2% of the population were working in agriculture. Now, what does that mean? Well, on the positive side, that means 38% of the working population were now available to do something else. They could build cars, they could build aircraft, they could put in place new skyscrapers, and of course build the IT sort of infrastructure that we see today. But on the flip side, the darker side, that meant that 38% of the working population either lost their jobs or they were unable to have their children go on and do the same job that they did. And communities that were built up around those jobs were disrupted. That change is hard. And those of us who are involved in making productivity a reality have to be sympathetic and recognize that change is both vital, but on a human level, it's not without cost.
Completely. And there's also, for anyone who runs a business will have seen this, if you can create efficiency. So let's say you can get one person to do the job of two. That gives you an extra person.
Exactly.
Great, in theory.
Exactly.
But if you don't use that extra person wisely, they can actually start doing things that can have a negative impact as well. They can create work, they can create red tape, they can so it's yeah.
Exactly right. And that's that sort of natural response to this transformation, this change, and the fear, the perfectly natural human fear that's going to come as a consequence of that, and then the defensiveness, and then how do we put in place as many barriers and as much friction as possible to preventing productivity. We shouldn't see this as a them and us type conflict. We have to recognize this is just a natural, normal part of the process, and it shouldn't be a reason not to do it. You know, businesses of a certain scale, they will be able to absorb those workers into other parts of the business, perhaps have less requirement for recruitment in other parts of the business because we can move people around. For smaller businesses, they won't have the opportunity to do that. It will ultimately result in somebody leaving the business. As a society, we're going to want to see those workers be able to move on and do something else. And that's perhaps a little bit where the industrial strategy comes in. And perhaps this back to the point about the role that government has in order to create a framework where we can have more confidence that if we do make those changes, there's going to be good, meaningful roles for others in the future.
Completely. And I think as well, coming back to wanting to see productivity rise, I mean, it makes sense from an economic point of view, but also if you break it down to just the smallest blocks of society, to individuals and what makes people happy. People are happy when they're contributing and being productive members of society.
You see it in different buildings and different businesses. When people know that every effort that they're doing is generating great value, and as a consequence from it, there is a real sense of purpose. It's a cliche to say they have a spring in their step in the morning, but you can see it, the energy. Of course, there's also going to come with stress, and there's going to come with a little bit of, conflict resolution, but people know they're doing something worthwhile. You see that in those businesses. Likewise, there are many businesses that you can see people know they're adding so little value. And of course, the time gets filled with politics and infighting and trying to come up with all sorts of reasons not to do X, Y, and Z. I can't believe anybody's enjoying that. They would much rather be doing the other one.
Best leadership advice you've ever received? Yeah,
this one's always hard to to come to terms with, but it's a good one. I was told this very early in my career, and it stuck with me all the way through. Always recruit people smarter than yourself. I still stand by that today. I've got a great team. I love working with them. And I know when I'm in the room, I know they're running rings around me, but that's great.
One business tool or app that you can't live without?
Can I have two?
Absolutely.
I think
we live in a world of abundance.
I live in a world of abundance. I would choose my vernier calipers, which is a very precise way of measuring things, because ultimately, as a problem solver, as an engineer, I need to get facts and data. And I'm sure you get this answer from many people, but Microsoft Excel, it's just so good.
Actually, you're the first one.
Okay, well, there you go. It's the secret's out of the bag. Yeah.
And finally, if you weren't running Chartwell, what do you think you'd be doing?
I often wonder, is it time to retire? Is it time to go and do something else? I've got to say, I really enjoy my job. I love the people I work with. So I have no desire to go and do something else. However, if for whatever reason those circumstances happened, I hope it'd be something to do with motorsport. I hope it'd be something to do with maybe stage rallying. That would be great. Whether it's on the mechanical side or the driving side, I'd be delighted. So I think that's my answer.
Nice. Do you do any race driving?
I started this year. My son's now of an age where we can do it together. And yes, I've recently had a rally car built, and I'm hoping to be competing later this year.
Wow. Excellent.
That's both scary and exciting.
I'll certainly keep an eye out for that.
Well, hopefully in a good way.
Yes. Fantastic. Andy, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you,
Really
David.
enjoyed it.
No, it's been a pleasure.